Welcome to Intro to Physical Anthropology. I'll be your instructor. I'm David Leitner, and today we're talking about the evolution of skin color. It's one of the most visible traits in human beings, or at least one of the traits that most human beings notice. And it's also probably the most misunderstood by a lot of us. So how did different skin colors come to be? And in a larger sense, how do all of the markers of race that we use actually evolve? Where did they come from? I'm not going to go through each one, but I'll make some general statements about skin that'll apply to others as well. So, to begin with, we need to think about how humans vary genetically. Now, classic racial theory sees races kind of like this. You've got a sort of core of the race that is quote-unquote pure, and then you've got these sort of margins where there's hybridization, right? So it looks like three intersecting circles, right? This is sort of the way most people think about race, even if they're not thinking in terms of purity and so forth. There's this idea that somehow there's some people who very clearly X race and some people who are more ambiguous, right? But that's not really the way genes are distributed in the human population. Rather, it looks a little more like this. Instead of being sort of intersecting circles, it's actually one big circle surrounding two little circles here, if we're using the sort of three race model here. But it's true no matter how many groups you break it into. That's the point. The African gene pool includes nearly every gene in the human genome that is also in either the Asian or European gene pool, if you're going to draw lines around them that way. That is because we share a common African ancestry. We all can trace our lineages, well, not historically, but we can all theoretically trace our lineages back to Africa 100 to 200,000 years ago. The reason there is reduced variation in the Asian and European populations is because of founder effect. Okay? When our ancestors who left Africa for the first time left, they weren't an even sampling of all of Africa. Humans had spread throughout Africa by that point. It was about 70 to 100,000 years ago. And it was only the gene pool of those people near the Middle East, near the Red Sea, that were able to cross. So that means there's a whole lot of genetic diversity that didn't make it out. And so the founder effect means that both of these gene pools are going to be smaller and not represent all of African diversity. That's why we see much larger diversity in the African, in the gene pools on the continent of Africa today than we do in Europe or in Asia or in the Americas. Founder effect, okay? Migration happens. So that then brings us to the question of how do we actually come to identify races by traits like skin color? Well, making categories from continuous variation, like height or weight, is a very arbitrary thing. There are better ways to make categories and not as good ways to make categories, but it's always kind of an arbitrary choice. Like, why is an 89% on a quiz a B, but a 90% is an A? How is that 1% so significant? Really, honestly. It's just because we say it's so. It's just because that's the way we culturally have done it. It's done differently in other places. Other countries have different scales they use for grades, but we do it this way. So, yeah, there's always a sense of arbitrariness when you're making categories out of continuous variation. For instance, tell me which of these buildings, well, you can't, obviously, this is a video, but think about it. Which of these buildings are small, which are medium, and which are large? If you poll the whole class, we'll come up with lots of different ways of matching them in for lots of different reasons. So sometimes making categories is a little arbitrary. It's the same way with skin tone. When you've only got 3 samples in front of you, like we do here, this is a chart that measures skin reflectance, how much light is reflected from the skin. To the left of the screen, are darker skin tones. To the right of the screen are lighter ones, meaning they reflect more light, and on the left they reflect less. And we've got people from 3 different places. So we've got the Chopi from Equatorial Africa, the Giro from the Himalayas, and the Netherlands from Europe, right? And if we look at these, it's real easy to split them into light, medium, and dark, right? That seems pretty sensible. As soon as we start filling in the gaps, though, things change a little bit. For instance, if I was going to ask you whether you thought somebody from Turkey or somebody from the British Isles would have darker skin, think for a moment about what you would say. Tell me which you would choose. Who would have the darker skin? Someone from Turkey or someone from the British Isles? Well, if you said Turkey, you're going to be surprised. Because Pembrokeshire there, that I've circled along with Turkey, is in fact in the country of Wales, which is in Great Britain, which is in the British Isles. So, and when we look, see, these little bars show the range of skin reflectance in that population, with the dots being the median or average of the population. And you can see that they overlap so much that the median of one is within the range of the other. Now, it might be at the extreme range, but that leaves a lot of people in between who overlap in terms of skin tone. So, while on average people in Turkey may have darker skin tones than people in Pembrokeshire on average, if we did just pull 2 people randomly from both, a person from each population, we wouldn't be guaranteed that the person from Turkey would always have darker skin. It's as simple as that. So even the differences we conceive of that seem to make common sense in our head oftentimes are very misleading, because the difference in color is intensified by our expectation that it is different. Okay. So we have to, when we start thinking about race biologically, we need to keep that in mind, that what makes common sense to us is influenced by the way our culture has already conditioned us to think about race. So, but that leaves the question. So why does skin tone vary so much? How did it come about? Well, the similarities and differences we see in skin tone, just like many other traits associated with race, are not consistent even within the races themselves. Okay, there's a lot of overlap, and oftentimes there's more difference within a race than there is between races. So that means using these markers is not a great measure of the existence of race. Instead, markers like this come about because of evolution. So, what causes skin color variation? Well, in general, it's exposure to ultraviolet light. I think most of us know that by now, but Yeah, exposure to ultraviolet light, ultraviolet radiation is, and location on the globe have more to do with predicting what color you are than your actual assigned race. Think about that. But of course that doesn't explain why it evolved that way. This is a map, by the way, of skin reflectance across the globe, and you'll notice two patterns here. One is that generally, the closer to the equator you are, the darker your skin is. And also, there are two places I want you to notice: in the Andes in South America, and in the Himalayas between Asia and the Indian subcontinent. Okay? There are little patches that are a little bit darker than the surrounding area there, aren't there? That's for a very good reason. Remember, if ultraviolet light is what's responsible, well, people at high latitudes get less sunlight, right, than those at mid-latitudes. But if you're high up on a mountain, you get more UV exposure than if you're on the ground, because there's less atmosphere to filter the UV out. Same thing's true for the latitudes. The reason that you get more light, more ultraviolet light at the equator than at the poles is because the Earth is round. And as the sunlight comes in towards the equator, it has only so much atmosphere to get through. But as it comes through at a steeper angle at higher latitudes, it actually will have to go through more atmosphere. And so even if you're at a higher latitude, if you go up in altitude, you'll be reducing the amount of atmosphere between you and the ultraviolet radiation, which means you'll get more exposure. So that pattern is very consistent. It's not just latitude, it's available ultraviolet light. But what's the driver? What's the selecting factor for skin tone here? It's not skin cancer. Keep in mind, skin cancer might slightly reduce reproductive success, but for most people it doesn't show up until they're towards the end of their reproductive years anyways, at least for women, and also for a lot of men too, let's be honest. So skin cancer doesn't have a huge effect in terms of natural selection. However, vitamin D does. Your skin does more than just sort of keep the water off your bones and, protect you from infection and all of that and keep your insides inside. It also is an organ that uses sunlight to synthesize vitamin D. So, some of the supporting evidence for this is what we know of it's something that happened in the 1990s in Great Britain. In the UK, in the 1990s, there was evidence of vitamin D deficiencies, an epidemic of vitamin D deficiency, with its highest incidence in South Asian and Afro-Caribbean communities. That increased incidence came about because at about the same time, the National Health Service, the NHS, had decided to adopt a breast-first, breast-only breastfeeding position when it came to newborns. Mothers were expected to breastfeed. Only under extraordinary circumstances were they supposed to resort to bottle feeding. As a result, well, here's the thing about the difference between the milk you drink in the carton and the milk that is produced naturally by most mammals. There is very little vitamin D in milk naturally. We add that vitamin D, interestingly, precisely because 120 years ago, there were epidemics of rickets. People, except it was a constant thing. Rickets is a vitamin D deficiency disease that, if it occurs in childhood, can result in lifelong deformities, that will have a huge impact, possibly be fatal in some instances, if they're severe enough. So the skeleton will not develop correctly, and as well as some of the neural tissues, I believe. I might be wrong about that, so somebody should fact check me. So yeah, so by abandoning formula, which has vitamin D added to it, mothers were no longer giving their babies as much vitamin D. Now, for light-skinned people, this wasn't a big problem. Light-skinned babies, even very little sunlight if you're light-skinned, even at high latitudes, to get enough sunlight to synthesize the vitamin D you need. So light-skinned babies, as long as they got some exposure to sunlight, even in the winter, were going to be relatively okay. Dark-skinned babies, on the other hand, would have trouble, and did have trouble. And so that was the explanation for this outbreak of vitamin D deficiencies in those communities, which are more likely to have people with darker skin. Now, this higher incidence of vitamin D deficiencies at high latitudes explains the evolution of light skin, correct? But there's also a dark skin also had to evolve. Our primate cousins don't have dark skin under their coats. They are protected from excess ultraviolet light by the fact that most of them live in forests, and they have thick hair all over their bodies. So dark skin had to evolve as well, and evolve for a similar but slightly different reason. Ultraviolet light not only helps synthesize vitamin D, it also breaks down folate. Unfortunately, if you are pregnant, there is a very crucial period when you need extra amounts of folate in order for your child to develop. The embryo starts to form what's called the neural tube, which is going to turn into the spine and the brain, the nervous system, right? If you have a folate deficiency at that point, as an adult, you're not going to notice much. But the embryo will not form the neural tube correctly, and it can often be fatal, and even when it's not fatal, it can have serious consequences for the normal development of the nervous system. So, in equatorial regions, the danger isn't not getting enough vitamin D, it's getting too much ultraviolet light, and that leading to not skin cancer, but breakdown of folate. So each of those are selective pressures pushing skin tones in different directions. This might be a good example, actually, of destabilizing selection that we talked about a while back, where the selective pressures are pushing in two different directions against the mean. So it's pushing away from middle skin tones. That said, the first Europeans were sort of medium skin tone, probably like the first African ape, or sorry, not African apes, the first African bipeds, first members of genus Homo, and so forth. They probably had medium tone skin, and it's only much later in Europe that actually some invaders somewhere in the east sort of came in carrying these new light skinned, light haired genes. That really, some of which are only 6,000 years old. This is a very new mutation, in fact. So, even Europe wasn't always white, is what I'm trying to say. Right. So that brings us back to the question of how closely related are we? We overlap a great deal, as I've already mentioned. Africa is our birthplace. It is our homeland. Every human being's homeland, ultimately, if you go back far enough. And that is because we evolved first in Africa. That is why the gene pool is so much more diverse there, and why the gene pools in other parts of the world are largely subsets of that gene pool. You can see here on this map 200,000 years ago, we first appear in Africa, and over the first 100,000 years or so, we mostly spread out in Africa. Then, between 70 and 50,000 years ago, we spread out of Africa, first to Southeast Asia, to South Asia, then Southeast Asia and the Malay Peninsula, on through into Australia eventually, by 50,000 years ago. We go further around 40,000 years ago into Asia, up into the Siberia and so forth, and 30 to 40,000 years ago, we go into Europe, where we meet the Neanderthals. And as we'll find out later, we started mixing with them. So most Europeans are part Neanderthal. It's probably not wrong to say that. Not an insult, by the way. Neanderthals are my favorite hominins. By between 15 and 20,000 years ago, at least one, probably more, probably two or more groups of Asian populations migrated across a land bridge or along the seacoast into North America, and then very quickly spread throughout the Americas into South America. And the final sort of major migration that isn't shown on here was the peopling of the Pacific Islands, which occurred around 3,000 years ago by the Polynesian peoples. That's us. This is our human history, guys. This is, number one, why race is not biologically real, and yet why we are so closely related to one another. In addition to all of this migration, keep in mind too that probably between 70 and 100,000 years ago, there was some major catastrophe. Some people theorized it was a supervolcano that nearly brought our species to the brink of extinction. Possibly as few as 600 breeding individuals left on the continent of Africa, and somehow we survived. That means that we are much more genetically closely related because we had a genetic bottleneck. The thing we talked about in the last chapter. So genetic diversity decreased considerably in Africa before the spread out. So we are very, very, very similar to one another genetically. So what that means is human races are not biologically real, but, and this is a big sort of asterisk over that statement, they are very real socially. Cultural constructs are real. Something that is only real because it's part of culture still has effects on people's lives on a day-to-day basis in very serious ways. Not just in terms of their lifestyle, their beliefs, etc., also in terms of their health. And in fact, actually, if you go to the Canvas site, there's a page up there talking about health disparities in the African American community. It's not the only minority community that experiences race-related and racism-related health disparities, but they are some of the starkest, and a reminder that the legacy of slavery continues to this day, continues hurting the African American community to this day, in part because the rest of us ignore that. Not to get on a soapbox or anything, but it's an important point to make. The biological reality of race has no impact, one way or the other, on the existence of racism whatsoever. Okay, with that said, I hope you're all taking care of yourself. Have a great evening, day, night, whatever time. And I will see you again soon. Bye-bye.